Where the minister says if anyone has reason, to protest the union of this man and his wife, let him speak now or forever hold his peace. Now, these wedding ceremonies really have their Old Testament and their scriptural basis. I didn't realize the extent to which that's true. You come down the aisle, right down the middle, and the congregation is sitting on the right and on the left. Well, it's symbolic of the Abrahamic covenant, where Abraham came and walked up and down in the middle of the two parts of a sacrifice. And so there's a lot of symbolism, but this line about speak now or forever hold your peace actually comes from the Old Testament, where if a father hears a daughter making a vow regarding something and he doesn't speak up, then the vow shall be held. Why? Because your silence is your consent. And then Bill Federer, this great, powerful reformer, educator, teacher that is part of the Courage Tour faculty we had, he's like a walking Hillsdale College curriculum, this guy. He lays it down, boom, that your being silent in the eyes of God and Scripture, when you see certain things happening in your nation, is a form of your tacit agreement, approval, and endorsement, because your silence is consent. That's one of 5 truth bombs that exploded over the audience when Bill Federer shared. And I decided I was going to give you the full enchilada. We're not just going to give you the typical 25 or 29-minute segment. I'm going to give you the whole 49 or 50-minute segment right here. You're going to devour this. And then if you're watching with the PowerPoints, you're going to love it. If you're in a podcast, you got to realize every point he's making, he has a PowerPoint for you. So you want to go on Facebook or on YouTube and catch the completely unfettered Bill Federer. And as the only thing I could think of that in our product catalog of things that we do here as an organization that can match this is he renews your mind like cellular. He brings clarity to you. And the Level 10 Matrix, I want to say this right now, the Level 10 Matrix product is probably the only therapy, the only strategy that I've seen that is reversed cognitive cloudiness or confusion off of people that are especially the older demographic, and it actually reversed many of the symptoms of brain fog and such. And that's just one of the testimonies. We've had remarkable testimonies of people from Pastor Shirley, who shared with us about her own journey from cancer into healing. And I want you guys to all be able to get the Level 10 Matrix information. So go to level10matrix.com. And make sure that you or contact us. Call us at 1-800-361-2270. If you're watching on Facebook or on Instagram, put the word Matrix down in the comments, and I'm going to show you how before you medicate, before you operate, at least seek the science to regenerate, because you might find that the missing piece is not what you thought it was. Make sure you go to level10matrix.com and check it out and enjoy the Professor Bill Federer today on our very special broadcast taken live from the Courage Tour, where we're listening to him in the audience in the 7 battleground states where God's people are being equipped with knowledge and power.
Thank you, Lance. I can't live up to that introduction, but it's an honor to be with you. Well, I have a PowerPoint, as he mentioned, and I'm going to had a project years ago. I wanted to research every single century of recorded human history to find out what the most common form of government is, and it's kings, basically gangs. But before I get into that, nationalism. We hear about Christian nationalism. Quickly, nationalism is the opposite of globalism, right? And there are people that want a global government, like Klaus Schwab, where he said by the year 2030 you'll own nothing and be happy, very similar to Karl Marx, who said the theory of communism may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. So you'll own nothing, right? And so Klaus Schwab wants world communism. And anyway, second, nationalism depends on the nation. And so if you're in a socialist nation or an Islamist nation or a communist nation, there are no individual rights. Our nation, you have individual rights from a creator, and it's government from the consent of the governed. So you get rights and you're in charge. That's a good thing. wouldn't we want to preserve a nation where we get rights that the government can't take away and we're in charge? So Lincoln said, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. So we want to preserve a nation where it's government of the people, by the people, for. In other words, we're in charge. Thirdly, Christian nationalism used to be called Christian patriotism. Do you know any pro-life group that calls itself anti-abortion? There are none. Pro-life groups call themselves pro-life. Why does the mainstream media always call pro-life groups anti-abortion? Negative word association. They're picking a word that they don't call themselves, but so why do they call Christian patriots Christian nationalists? Because they know that word has a negative connotation, right? Because it was used against the socialist countries like the National Socialist Workers' Party in Germany called Nazi. But it used to be called Christian patriotism, and every president, Democrat and Republican, was in favor of it. So George Washington said, to the distinguished character of patriot, it should be our highest glory to laud the more distinguished character of Christian, right? Patriot, Christian. Lincoln, in his inaugural address, said intelligence, patriotism, Christianity, and a firm reliance on him who has never yet forsaken his favored land are still competent to adjust in the best way all our present difficulty. He mentions patriotism and Christianity right next to each other in his inaugural address. Theodore Roosevelt, Lincoln, Republican, freed the slaves. Ulysses S. Grant, Republican, started the Department of Justice to stop the KKK that the Democrat Party had started in the South, right? A sort of an under-the-table group. And then you had Teddy Roosevelt, Republican. He's the first president to have a black man in the White House for dinner, Booker T. Washington. But the Democrats in the South had lynchings, about 4,000 are documented, plus lots more. But anyway, Theodore Roosevelt said, the mob lynches a Negro. Every Christian patriot in America needs to lift up his voice in loud and eternal protest against the mob spirit. So he says Christian and patriot, right? And so FDR, Democrat, he passed out Gideon's New Testaments and Book of Psalms to all the soldiers in World War II. He wrote the foreword. Could you imagine a president passing out New Testaments? Today it would probably be, Korans and Bhagavad Gita's and Satanist books, who knows? So Franklin Roosevelt, in his foreword, he says, as commander-in-chief, I take pleasure in commending the reading of the Bible to all who serve in the armed forces. Clearly, he wants to defend our nation, and clearly he's Christian because he's passing out New Testaments, right? And so would they call Franklin Roosevelt a Christian nationalist? Right? And so Roosevelt said those forces hate democracy and Christianity as two phases of the same civilization. They oppose democracy because it is Christian. They oppose Christianity because it preaches democracy. Another quote, FDR said, the whole world is divided between pagan brutality and the Christian ideal. We choose human freedom, which is the Christian ideal. And then Eisenhower said, any group that awakens us, all of us, is a dedicated patriotic group that can well take the Bible in one hand, the flag in the other, and march ahead. So did you know that in 1965, 93% of Americans identified themselves as Christian? Right? 69% Protestant, 24% Catholic, and then there were 3% Jewish. But the country has been patriotic and a majority Christian. But the left is doing something called psychological projection, where they are blaming us for what they are doing. It's in the Bible. Potiphar's wife accused Joseph of lusting after her when she was lusting after him, right? So they're the ones that want to set up a woke nationalism, a Satanist theocracy, a trans dominionism, right? They want to push their views down the throat of everybody, but yet they're wanting to accuse us of doing it, right? And so it's important for us to understand that they're doing this psychological operation on us. I thought it was interesting, this article called Follow the Money to the After Party. So the Rockefeller Foundation is helping to bankroll an after-party Bible study, which is to train Christians not to get involved. All right? And yet the same grant round is a group seeking to promote the leadership of the LGBTQ plus community. And so you have the Rockefeller Foundation is giving money to mobilize LGBT activists to get involved and giving money to groups to get the Christians uninvolved. What a brilliant strategy. Tell your opponents to sit home and guilt trip them and by calling them names, and then you give money to your groups. Now, big picture. As Lance said, I like to zoom out. So there's two phases of America's history that I want to focus on. The 1600s, you had Puritans, and they were nicknamed Old Lights. And then the 1700s are Pietists, they're nicknamed New Lights. So I'm going to get into this. So I read through world history. So the default setting for human government is what? It's gangs. If we were to get rid of all laws tomorrow, there'd be gangs. And a glorified gang leader we call a king, or a pharaoh, or a Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar, but power concentrates into the hands of one person. Now, the first record we have is Nimrod, Tower of Babel, in the plains of Shinar. And Josephus said he wanted to build a tower so high that if God destroyed the world again with a flood, he could survive on top. And so it was defiant against God. And he made everybody in town bake bricks and bring him, or he would kill them. So defiant against God, oppressive over man. And God comes down and confuses the languages, and the people scatter. The Tower of Babel was, in a sense, the first attempt at a one-world government. Right? But then God confuses the language. They scatter into language groups that turn into nations. In other words, nations were God's invention to postpone a one-world government. Take the population of the world, divide them into groups, and they'll always compete with each other and keep each other in check. But every generation you have a king, a gang leader that wants to conquer other nations, and if left unchecked, he would have been happy to keep conquering his whole life and eventually become the Antichrist. And so death is a blessing, and the devil has to start from scratch again. So we have Nimrod, Tower of Babel, and Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and Sargon of Akkadian, and 2,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs, and 5,000 years of Chinese emperors and kings of Assyria. He's the one that took the 10 tribes of Israel captive in the north. Then we got Cyrus of Persia, let the Jews go back. We got Alexander the Great. And these empires keep getting bigger because with the latest military advancements, kings can kill more people. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they can kill with a bronze weapon or an iron weapon or a phalanx spear, a scimitar, sword, gunpowder, directed energy weapon, right? I mean, the weapon improves, but it's that same fallen nature of Cain killing Abel. And with technological advancements, kings can track more people. Did you know in about 2 BC, Augustus Caesar wanted to have a worldwide tracking system? It's called the census, a tax enrollment. If he could have had 5G and cell phones and facial recognition software, he'd have been tempted to use that. So these kings want to control larger areas and track larger areas. And you got Aschamite Empire in Africa and Attila the Hun and Justinian. And then Islam comes along. And then Charlemagne, and then the Vikings and Genghis Khan. In the 1200s, he conquers from Korea to Hungary, kills 30 million people. He'd have been glad to be a world leader. Tamerlane, Ivan the Terrible of Russia. Then across to this hemisphere, and you've got Montezuma, right? And they're ripping hearts out of captured slaves to the sun god in Atahualpa and Inca Peru, and the king of Spain. The sun never set on the Spanish Empire, and then the French Empire, and then the British Empire. But one thing we observe is that the most common form of government is kings, and what the king believes his kingdom has to believe. Remember Nebuchadnezzar says, bow to my statue or I'm going to throw you in the fiery furnace. I don't care if you have a warm feeling in your heart for my statue, you bow. And so kings want to it's considered treason to not believe exactly the way your government believes. Reformation comes along, I'm skipping lots of stuff, but now you have large percentage of kingdoms believing something other than the king. And so you have Switzerland Calvinist, Scotland Presbyterian, Holland Dutch Reformed, Northern Sweden and Germany Lutheran. Italy was Catholic and Greece was Greek Orthodox. It was one denomination per country. And if you didn't believe the way your particular king did, it was considered treason. And the king didn't like that. And so Spain controlled the Netherlands. And in 1572, the king of Spain, Philip II, sends the Iron Duke of Alba to commit the Spanish Fury. And he kills 10,000 of these Dutch Reformed Protestants. It's called the Spanish Fury. And same year, it was a bad year, 1572, the Queen of France, Catherine de' Medici, 10% of France is Huguenot Protestant. She doesn't like that. She decides to have a wedding in Paris of her daughter Margaret with the main Huguenot Protestant leader. His name was Henry of Navarre. At a big wedding in Paris, a couple days after the wedding, everybody's still hanging around. She has her soldiers pull chains across the streets so the carriages cannot ride out of town. She sends her soldiers house to house. They kill 30,000 of these Huguenot Protestants. It's called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. And so you have a problem in Europe. What do you do with Romans chapter 13? Let everyone be subject to the governing authority, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. It's like, yeah, but what if the authority that exists wants to kill your wife and children? And so you had people protesting, and so they were nicknamed Protestants or Protestants. One of them was John Calvin, and he writes, "We are subject to the men who rule over us, but subject only in the Lord. If they command anything against him, let us not pay the least regard to it." It's sort of like Ephesians 6, children obey your parents. But what if there's a bad parent that tells the kid to sell themselves into prostitution and kill the neighbor? Is that child supposed to obey that parent? No, the child obeys the parent as long as the parent's telling them to do something that lines up with God's word. You obey the government as long as the government's telling you to do something that lines up with God's word. I mean, why would God tell you to do something in his word and then tell you to submit to a government that tells you not to do what he just got done telling you to do? And so Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail, he said, "One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God." And so we have most of world history is kings. The Reformation comes along, and you have large percentages of population believing something other than the king. The king doesn't like that, he's killing them. And you got these reformers, and John Calvin was the pioneer, and he helped develop a form of government without a king. That's a novel idea. And it's called a covenant form of government. And everybody has to agree to it, and everybody has to participate in it. And so it's this idea, you get blessings from God, you voluntarily share them with your neighbor because you're doing it as unto God. You get rights from a creator, you're fair to your neighbor because you're accountable to God, who is not a respecter of persons. It's a way to keep order in society with no government, with no police. And so where did these Puritans, these Calvinists get this idea? From the Bible. But what part of the Bible? The first 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul. Right? So you have around 1400 BC, millions of Israelites come out of Egypt, they come into the promised land, and for 400 years there's no king. And this is an anomaly in world history. It's the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, right? Up until you get King Saul. And we read the book of Judges, we read all that. It's sort of a confusing period. Then we get on to King Saul and King David, King Solomon. But if you zoom in, it's 400 years, millions of people and no king. And so it's called the Hebrew Republic. It's a total anomaly in world history. And so these Puritans that studied this were nicknamed Christian Hebraists, and that's why they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. And so the idea is everybody, a couple million of them, everybody's taught the law, and they're personally accountable to God to follow the law. So you have an opportunity to steal. Nobody is around. No, there's no police. And you're about to steal, and then you think, God is watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates something in your head called a conscience. If everybody in the country believes this, you can maintain complete order with no police. This is what these Calvinist Puritans in New England and Baptists and Presbyterians and Quakers, right, the Dutch Reformed, they all looked to this period of 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul. And it worked. in ancient Israel until the priest stopped teaching the law. You said, they did? Yeah, here's Eli, the high priest. His own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. He's not even teaching the law to his kids. And then there's a Levite with a graven image in the house of a guy named Micah. The tribe of Dan comes along, steals the graven image, tells this Levite, come along with us, you can be a priest to our whole tribe. And you're reading the story in the book of Judges, scratching your head saying, what's this Levite doing with the graven image? Isn't that one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have them? And then the terrible story of a Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with the woman he's not even married to. He's not following the law, and they're traveling, and the house is surrounded by sodomites. Something about that behavior that appears at the last stages of a people ruling themselves. This casting off the self-restraint. They raped a poor girl to death, and by the time you're grossed out by that story, you read this line, every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Why? Because the priest stopped teaching what was right in the Lord's eyes. Imagine they teaching the kids there's no God, there's no right, there's no wrong. You can do whatever you want. You can be a girl today, a boy tomorrow. You can be a fuzzy the next day. There's no morals, there's no boundaries. And you shove these kids out on the street and they're like, I don't have any guidelines. I want what you have. Boom, right? And we're all shocked that they acted out what they were taught in school. Anyway, so they go to to Samuel the prophet, and they said, we want to be like the other countries. We want a king. Samuel cries, and the Lord tells him, they did not reject you, they rejected me. And so they end up getting King Saul, an important story. Saul is pouting that his son Jonathan became friends with David, and he goes to his soldiers, none of you soldiers care about me. And one soldier says, I care. I saw David go to this town, and the priest gave him some bread and the sword of Goliath. And Saul says, bring those priests to me. They show up. He turns to his soldiers and says, kill them. The soldiers hesitate. Doeg the Edomite goes out there and kills them all. What just happened? The soldiers had been operating under the old system where everybody's accountable to God to follow the law. And the law says you need 2 or more witnesses before you condemn somebody to death. So the soldiers are like, okay, king, you're telling me to kill, and there's supposed to be 2 witnesses, there's only 1, and I'm accountable to God. They're hesitating, they still have a conscience. Doeg says, king, I'm going to surrender my conscience to you. You tell me to kill, I'll kill. Tell me to kill the baby in the womb, I'll kill it. Tell me there's no more male and female. I'm just a bunch of mush. You blow your trumpet, I'll bow to your stand. The government always wants to dictate to people their beliefs, and God is jealous. He doesn't want the government between you and him. And so, why is this important? Because the kings of Europe looked to the Bible for their authority, but they looked to the King Saul and on part of the Bible, the divine right of kings. God chose me, I'm in charge, I'm going to rule through fear. The Calvinist Puritans that founded America looked to the pre-King Saul period of the Bible, that you get millions of people, everybody's taught the law and accountable to God to follow it. Os Guinness said covenantal ideas in England were the lost cause, but they became the winning cause in New England. Covenant shaped constitutionalism. The American Constitution is a nationalized, secularized form of covenant. Covenant lies behind Constitution, and the word federal is Latin for covenant. We have a covenant form of government in America where we can rule ourselves without a king bottom up. And so the King of England turns up the heat, and you have 20,000 Puritans flooding into New England, and you have pastors and their churches founding communities. And so you have a pastor, John Lothrop, and his little covenant church found a city called Barnstable, Massachusetts. And a pastor, Roger Williams, and his church found a community called Providence, Rhode Island, and the First Baptist Church in America. And you have a pastor, John Wheelwright, and his little covenant church found a city, Exeter, New Hampshire. And another pastor and his church, Thomas Hooker, found a city called Hartford, Connecticut. They're taking their church government, covenant, everybody's involved, and they're making it their civil government. Everybody's involved. And so Thomas Hooker's church members come to him and say, can you preach a sermon on how we're supposed to set up our government? And he gives a sermon in 1638 titled The Foundation of Authority is Laid in the Free Consent of the People. Everybody say consent. This is unique. It's reflected in our Declaration, government from the consent of the governed. And this is different from Europe, because in Europe, the kings did not ask the people for their consent. So lo and behold, the whole idea of us voting and giving our consent came from this church structure. His sermon's written down. It's called The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. That's why they call Connecticut the Constitution State. Here's a plaque in England. It says, Thomas Hooker, founder of the state of Connecticut, father of American democracy. Did you know that? There's a statue of Thomas Hooker holding a Bible on the old Capitol grounds in Hartford, And at the base it says, leading his people through the wilderness, he founded Hartford. On this side, he preached the sermon, which inspired the fundamental orders, first written constitution that created a government. Another plaque, Thomas Hooker, a peerless leader in New England thought and life in both church and state, right? He's a preacher, right? And then another plaque, it says Thomas Hooker, leader, preacher, statesman who based all civil authority on the free consent of the people. They chiseled it in stone. You don't appreciate it until you zoom on and look at all the history. At this time, you have Russian czars, Muslim sultans, Indian maharajas, Chinese emperors, Japanese emperors, African chieftains, kings of Spain. The whole world is kings. And you got this little greenhouse in America where you have people giving their consent, and it came from these Calvinist Reformed churches that came from the Reformation, that came from the Bible, what part of the Bible? That first 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul. And so the people that say, well, you just got to submit to the government, they need to move over to Europe, over to communist China, over to North Korea, where they're ruled by a dictator, a monarch, a king. If you want to be in America, you realize that you are supposed to give your consent to what happens. Anyway, more plaques. And so this is an interesting one. Thomas Hooker's congregation established the form of government upon which the present Constitution of the United States is modeled. Do you grasp the significance of that? Church government influenced the civil government. So in New England, instead of separation of church and state, it was the pastors and churches that created the state. How could you say pastors don't preach on politics when it's the pastor's sermon that's their constitution? How could you say church members don't get involved in politics when all there was in Hartford was the church members? They were founding the city. And so the word polis is Greek. It means city, like Indianapolis. Politics is the business of the city. And in the city of Hartford, all there was the church. They had one building called the meeting house. That's where the pastor would teach the Bible, and that's where they would do their city business. The word synagogue means meeting house. That's where the rabbi would teach the law, and that's where they would do their city business. I mean, why build a separate building just to talk about a different topic? So when the revolution starts, the British send over a military governor, Thomas Gage, and he outlaws meeting houses, outlaws gatherings. We're going to shut down the churches. We don't want you getting together, right? He says, you just obey government mandates. I got a mandate from the king, you're just going to obey. I don't need you giving your consent to anything. And we're like, no, in America, nothing happens unless we give our consent. And he's like, no, you obey government mandates. And we're like, no, nothing happens unless we give our consent to it. He's like, no, you're a zombie, you're a robot, you do what you're told. When the government issues a mandate, you just blindly surrender your conscience and obey. And we're like, no, nothing happens unless we give our consent to it. It turns into a revolutionary war and we win. And we set up a form of government where we, the people, rule through our consent, government from the consent of the governed. So Romans 13 is understood differently in a monarchy versus a republic. Monarchs have subjects who are subjected to their will, right? So subjects submit to the king. In a republic, the citizens are the king. That right there would solve a whole lot of problems. You have these people studying theology and they're not studying history, they're not studying government. It's like, hello, in America, the citizen is the king. It's a Greek word, it means co-king, co-ruler, co-sovereign. Subjects obey. Did you want to get a picture of that? Right? So subjects submit to the king. Republic, citizens are the king. Subjects obey, citizens give consent. And so that's the 1600s. It's this revolutionary century where we come up with a form of government where you can have people ruling themselves without a king, bottom up. But after a century, it got spiritually dry. And you had some of them saying, you know, God has a great plan for your life, marriage, family, church, or government. Find out what the plan is, put it into place. And it got so plan-focused, it was only a plan. You're just learning the system. It got so dry, they were nicknamed old lights. And some of them said, you know what, God is so smart, he already knows who's going to end up in heaven, so don't even bother preaching the gospel. And so you had David Brainerd expelled from Yale because he said his professor was as spiritual as a chair. And so in the 1700s, you have the new lights. They said, look, it's more than a plan. You have to have an experience with Jesus. And when you do, you're going to live holy and withdraw from worldly things like bars and brothels and government. Wait, what was that last thing? Well, let's take this apart. So in 1517, Martin Luther starts the Reformation. He had a personal revelation, the just shall live by faith. Very personal. So much that he was willing to stand up to the most powerful guy in the world, the king of Spain. But some German princes said, this is my chance to break away from Rome. Kingdom of mine, I just decided you're all Lutherans. People say, okay, great, king, we're Lutherans now. What do we believe? So for the people in the kingdoms, it's not the same personal experience Martin Luther had. It's just a new state doctrine. So a revival movement starts called pietism that said being a Christian is more than state doctrine. Even if it's good doctrine, you have to have an experience with Jesus. And when you do, your life will change and you won't do worldly things anymore, like go to bars and brothels and lewd theater and get involved in worldly government. And it turned into the German concept of the two kingdoms, the kingdom of the government, the kingdom of the church. The two don't touch. And so where the Puritan says, you be involved in both. Everybody's involved in the church. Everybody's involved in the community. You can do two things. You can be a spouse and you can be a parent. Two totally different roles. But one person can do them. You can be involved in church and you can be involved in government. You can do both. No, but these pietists, these new lights, said, no. When you become a Christian, you have to withdraw from worldly things like government. So it's just the church. Just be involved in the church. Well, I have a question. If all of the spiritual people withdraw from the government because they want to be holy, who's left? Who's left in the government? The ungodly, right? The unspiritual. Well, since they're unspiritual, what are they going to do? They're going to yield to their selfish ambition. And they're going to end up ruling the government top down, and they can't resist the temptation to rule the church top down. And so you had German princes donating money to these pietists to say, hey, here's some more money, teach your people not to get involved in my business, stay out of my hair. And you had 4 centuries of that allowed Hitler to put Jews on train cars, and they're going right past the church crying out for help. And they're hearing the Jews crying for help, and the church's response was, well, that's the government doing that, and we're the church, and we can't get involved in government stuff because we're over here and they're over. So let's just sing praise songs to Jesus louder. Can anybody see there's something wrong with that picture? And so, now I have to give credit where credit's due. The Pietists did preach revivals, and you had the Moravians going around the world, and they influenced John Wesley, and the Wesleys influenced George Whitefield, and he preached this Great Awakening Revival up in America. It was great, but the byproduct was if you really become a Christian, you should not be involved, and one of them was Henry Muhlenberg, founder of the Lutheran Church in America, and he was a Pietist. Don't get involved. He had 2 sons, John Peter Muhlenberg, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, and they're not get involved type guys. And the revolution starts. And John Peter Muhlenberg goes to George Washington and says, I want to help. Washington says, I'm going to make you a colonel. Go get your men. He goes to church, preaches a sermon out of Ecclesiastes. There's a time to gather stones, a time to scatter stones, a time to embrace, a time to refrain from embracing, a time to preach, and a time to fight. And he takes off his black clerical robe, and underneath he has a uniform of an officer in the Continental Army. He has an altar call, 300 men of his church kiss their wives goodbye, right off to become the 8th Virginia Regiment. And his statue is in the U.S. Capitol because he became a congressman. Now his brother, Frederick, is writing letters to John Peter saying, you have become too involved in matters which, as a preacher, you have nothing whatsoever to do. John Peter writes back accusing Frederick of being a Tory British sympathizer. Frederick writes back and says he could not serve 2 masters. Right? The government, the church, the 2 don't touch. I got to pick one. I'm going to pick the church, so I can't get involved in the government. And then the British invade New York, and they burn Frederick's church. And then he decides, maybe I do need to get involved. He becomes a congressman, and he gets elected the first Speaker of the House. Right? Mike Johnson is the Speaker. The very first Speaker of the House was a Lutheran pastor, pietist, uninvolved, turned getting involved, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. And what did they pass in that first session of Congress? The First Amendment. Does anybody think that these 2 pastors, John Peter and Frederick Augustus, they're both in that first session of Congress, they're both passing the First Amendment. Does anybody think that they would vote to outlaw themselves? Pastors aren't supposed to be involved in politics, even though we are pastors and we are involved. No, the First Amendment, as well as the first 10 amendments, were handcuffs on the federal government to keep it from becoming a big federalized monster like King George III ruling through mandates. So why can't it be both? Why can't we have a middle of the road where it is a covenant plan, we get to rule ourselves, and it is a personal experience with Jesus? I mean, think of it. Yes, it is a personal experience with Jesus. Thank God for that. But don't you want to leave a country to your kids where they have a chance to have a personal experience with Jesus? Because if you don't get involved, what they're teaching your kids is there is no God. And if he does exist, he is messed up. He's put in men and women's bodies, and you have to have operations to fix them. He's either powerless and confused, or worse yet, he's sadistic. And if that behavior's not sin, what behavior? Sex outside of marriage. You know, all the little library books with all these graphic pictures they're showing these little kids. If sex outside of marriage is not sin, arguably there are no sins. And if there's no sins, you don't need a Savior to save you from your sins. What an irony. Christians who believe the gospel are letting their children be taught an Antichrist gospel. I'm enjoying my personal relationship with Jesus so much that I'm going to not get involved so my kids will be taught the Antichrist gospel, that there is no God and there are no sins and you don't need a Savior, right? So the most important thing is to bring people to Christ. The second most important thing is to preserve the freedom to do the most important thing. Now, to those that think it's holy not to be involved, and we've all met people, oh, our church, we just preach the gospel. We just preach Jesus. We don't get involved in politics. We all met those. I have a question for them. What do you do with Numbers chapter 30? It's the silence equals consent chapter of the Bible. A verse, a daughter binds herself with a vow while she's still living in her father's house in her youth. And her father hears her vow. And if he holds his peace when he hears her vows, all her vows stand. But if her father overrules her on the day he hears, then none of her vows shall stand, and the Lord will release her. That's come down to us as vows in a wedding ceremony. And the pastor tells the church members, if you are silent when you hear these vows, you're giving consent. Speak now or forever hold your peace. And so if it's called the rule of tacit admission, T-A-C-I-T. It's in Black's Law Dictionary, an admission reasonably inferable from a party's failure to act or speak. And so it's in debt collection. Somebody owes you money, you wait 10 years to try to collect. The judge will say, you're past the statute of limitations. If you really thought they owed you money, you would not have been silent for so long. It's in trademark law. You design a trademark, and lo and behold, somebody copies it and they're using it. If you don't try to defend your trademark, the judge will say, well, you knew about it, you didn't say anything, they get to use it. It's in real estate law. If you have a piece of property and somebody is squatting in your property, and you don't try to evict them or charge them rent, they can gain title to your property through adverse possession, just by you being silent. It's in our Constitution, Article 1, Section 7. Congress passes a bill, puts it on the president's desk. If any bill shall not be returned by the president within 10 days, the same shall be a law in like manner as if he had signed it. All he has to do is be silent for 10 days, and it's exactly the same as if he had signed it. So if a church member's silence gives consent to wedding vows, it gives consent to other things. And if they're killing babies in the community and the church members are silent, the church members are giving consent to killing babies, right? If you give consent to sin, you're an assessor, you share in the judgment. Leviticus 20. Any Israelite who sacrifices any of his children to Molech is to be put to death. If the members of the community close their eyes when that man sacrifices one of his children to Molech, I myself will set my face against him and his family and will cut them off from their people together. All you have to do is close your eyes while they kill the kid, and you're cut off. You know, last year they had a bill in California to kill babies 28 days after birth, and enough people said, I can't be silent anymore, and they went to Sacramento and pressured those legislators to change it. Apostle Paul, Acts 22, talking to the Lord. And he says, and when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by consenting to his death. Paul did not throw a stone. He didn't say a word. But he knew he was guilty for the death of Stephen just by standing there silent. Why? Proverbs 24, rescue those who are unjustly sentenced to death. Don't stand back and let them die. Don't try to disclaim responsibility by saying you didn't know about it. For God, who knows all hearts, knows yours, and he knows that you knew, and he will repay everyone according to his deeds. Esther, Mordecai says to her, if you remain silent at this time, deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. Here's one, Numbers 20. Moses and Aaron are called to the door of the tabernacle. And the Lord spake to Moses, take the rod, gather the assembly, thou and Aaron, speak to the rock, it shall give forth water. He gathers the assembly, And he lifts up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice, and water came out abundantly. End of the chapter. And the Lord spake to Moses, Aaron will not enter the land because both of you rebelled against my command at the waters of Meribah. It's like both. We just read the chapter. Aaron didn't do anything. He didn't say anything. Yeah, that's just it. He was at the door of the tabernacle. He heard God say, speak to the rock. When Moses lifted up the rod the first time and hit the rock, it probably took Aaron by surprise. When Moses lifted up the rod the second time, Aaron knew what was coming, and he didn't protest. He didn't say, well, Moses, hold it. I was there at the door. I heard God say, speak to it. No, he was silent, and in that instant, Aaron was guilty. Moses's was a sin of commission. Aaron's was a sin of omission. Leviticus 5, a person sins because he did not speak up, even when he was an eyewitness to a case or knew what happened. Anyone who failed to testify, he is guilty. Martin Luther King, he who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetuate it. He who accepts evil without protesting it is really cooperating with it. We all know this line, Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself. Do you know the verse right before it? Confront your neighbor directly so you will not be held guilty for their sin. One translation says, rebuke your neighbor directly and you will not incur guilt because of him. So they're all loving each other, and they're correcting each other. It's like with your parent, with your kid. You love them, but you correct them. Right? So I was reading the thing, they're going through transition. Just accept them, just accept them. You love your kid and you correct your kid. Look, if you let them do whatever they want, they'd feel like eating candy all day long. Proverbs 9:8, rebuke a wise man, and he will love thee. Ecclesiastes 7, it's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than the song of fools. New Testament, Luke, if your brother sin, rebuke him. 2 Timothy 4:2, preach the word. Be instant in season, out of season. Reprove, rebuke. Now, you can do it nicely. 1 Timothy 5:1, rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father. What does entreat mean? It doesn't mean being silent. It means you're saying something politely, right? And so they have a tactic. Their tactic is to guilt trip Christians into being more Christian than Christ. They say, if you're really a Christian, you will be silent while we teach your kids something Jesus would never teach the kids, right? The trans agenda. I mean, would Jesus teach the trans agenda? We know what Jesus taught, Matthew 19. He who made them at the beginning made them male and female. These precious little kids made in the image of God. I mean, think of the insanity. School counselors who cannot even define what a woman is think they are able to tell a boy he's supposed to be a girl. It's like, you can't even define girl. How do you know he's supposed to be one? It's insanity. And the churches are sitting back. And Jesus said, if you cause one of these little ones who believes in me to stumble, to fall into sin, it would be better for you to be thrown into the sea with a large millstone hung around your neck. So it's going to be a rude awakening for all those church members that think, we're just preaching Jesus, we're just preaching the gospel, we're not going to get involved, when they wake up and realize that they've been silent. They've been giving consent to all that wicked stuff, and they're inviting the judgment of God on their heads. Now, a scriptural case can be made that God cares about children, right? And so the answer is local, local, local. We can't do everything, but we can do something. And one observation is that there are more people in churches in a community than vote in a school board race. If we all just said, look, we don't agree with every church on everything, but none of us are happy with what they're teaching the kids. Let's pick some mama bear, get behind her and vote her in. And then once she's in, pack out that school board meeting early so she doesn't get beat up on, right? And we can begin to turn it around. And I'm convinced if the church can just take responsibility for these little children that Jesus loves in their neighborhood surrounding their church, all the other races will take care of themselves. The people that want to run for something, they'll learn how the blood vessels that have gone there, they'll learn how it all works. All they need is the blessing from the pastor that it's okay for them to be involved. And so there's different groups, right? There's Turning Point Faith right out there. And they want to help pastors. Dran Reese with the Truth and Salt and Light Coalition. Now, an observation. As more power concentrates into fewer hands globally, God's counterbalance is to get more people involved locally, right? Klaus Schwab, George Soros, and Zuckerberg, they're all concentrating more and more power in fewer hands. Well, guess what? God's counterbalance is to get more and more people. I think God is setting us up for a revival, and there's not going to be one or two or a handful of preachers getting the credit. It's going to be the entire body of Christ getting involved, each person doing what gift they got them. They're all going to participate like in this covenant form of government. They're all going to get involved, and Jesus alone will get the glory.
America is under a spirit of delusion.
America has abandoned God.
Women are being used as pawns, which is exactly what the left does.
We had given the keys to our church to the government and said, government, you run this church. You make the decisions for me.
When we vacate the public square and leave that to chance, something fills the void.
When liberty hangs in the balance, and your children, your grandchildren, your nieces and nephews come to you and they say, where were you when tyranny knocked on our door? What are you going to tell them?
What's it actually going to take? Seriously, what kind of trigger point will cause the church just to come out of this zombie stupor and say, okay, that's it, I've had it?
The church shouldn't be in a bunker waiting on the rapture, but ought to be invading the mountains of influence for the glory of God.
We have to save our nation. We have to save our children.
We don't have the luxury of disunity. I don't have to agree with you on everything. We need to fight for this nation together. Together.
Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the absence of allowing fear to dictate the outcome.
My job for all of you is to find the unfinished assignment, because America is too young to die.
Fighting for liberty and freedom is difficult. It is hard. Choose your heart.
Where the mothers will suddenly see and perceive the organized threat against their little boys and their little girls, and that they will rise up.
Because you've got a nation to save. You've got grandchildren to save.
This is for the states we're going to. It's for the souls that are coming in.
And this courage tour is so important because we must stand. We must move into the public square.
And I heard the Lord say this over you tonight. Oh, we say now, you haven't seen anything yet. You haven't seen anything yet. You haven't seen anything yet. And just you wait. This is just the beginning.
Liberty and freedom are not free. Every veteran understands this. It requires a very significant level of sacrifice. What legacy are you willing to leave behind for the next generation?
Register today at thecouragetour.com. All seats are free. Did you enjoy this latest episode? Please remember to share it with your friends, because the more knowledge you have, the better equipped you are to navigate the world.